Entry 7. Decision is an engineer's word. I do not make impulses public. I map choices, calculate risk, and then execute in the quiet of preparation. The decision to deviate was not a flash, it was a curve that smoothed across days of consideration. I tried to imagine outcomes, not just immediate ones, but the second-order consequences. Would a trace increase attention? Would it invite copycats? Would it accelerate my own entropy? Risk is not merely about exposure. It is about changing the terms of a game that had been static for years. If I alter the variables, the system will respond. Systems dislike novelty. They reconfigure. That reconfiguration is what I wanted to study. So I chose the variable carefully. It had to be credible as an accidental remnant to the many readers who skim headlines and move on. It had to be legible to someone who knows where to look. It had to be small enough to be plausible, large enough to be meaningful. I rehearsed the placement in my head like a surgeon rehearses an incision. The trace would be a partial print on glass, smudged enough to be dismissed by casual technicians, clear enough under dedicated lift procedures to be noticed by a competent analyst. Alternatively, a single fiber from a textile that is rare enough to be cataloged but common enough to avoid immediate linkage. Or perhaps the very human redundancy of a hair caught under a thumbnail, micro-evidence that tells a story only to someone who is still reading these sentences. The decision was made on a Tuesday. I like Tuesdays for such things. Routine muffles suspense. That night I sharpened instruments and practiced restraint. That is the honest part. The most exhilarating thing about this deviation was not the risk, but the anticipation. Anticipation organizes the mind. I set up parameters. I am allergic to flourish. Any flourish is a confession disguised as bravado. The variable must be binary, present or absent, legible only when lifted correctly. I sketched a decision tree on the back of a receipt, scenarios branching like capillaries. Discovery by chance, discovery by competent analysis, discovery by sensational media. Each branch had probabilities attached. I assigned weights. I recalculated when a non-trivial variable, a holiday, a parade, a change in shift, moved the odds by fractions. Precision in planning is its own form of consolation. I want a single ear. The press complicates everything. I read pundits' headlines the way others read horoscopes, looking for the mood more than the content. When papers breed melodrama, they teach the public to expect drama. I mocked sensational killers for their theatrics the way a surgeon mocks blunt instruments. Yet satire has the odd habit of revealing one's own hunger. The night I decided, I found a column praising declining crime rates as a triumph of policy and technology. The article celebrated algorithms and cameras, the triumph of data. I folded the paper and felt the irritation of someone whose work is measured in absences. The city's confidence in its systems is a complacency I can exploit. If they believe every problem now has a digital solution, they are less likely to look for the analog questioner at their margins. There was also the ethics rehearsal to be performed in my head. I do not do ethics for others. Ethics are public narratives. They feed on spectacle. But I do interrogate my own constraints. I made a list. No children, no cruelty for its own sake, no trophies. These were not moral decisions, but engineering constraints, boundaries that preserved method. The truth is cruder. Constraints are useful. They make experiments repeatable. They keep the researcher from becoming the variable. The ritual of restraint is physical. I practice stillness in shops and trains, letting my hands rest in my lap as if they were appliances. I rehearsed leaving a scene without anticipation visible on my face. I brushed my fingers along glass in public, feeling how a partial ridge transfers, how oils smear and then fade. When you do something 1,000 times, you can feel how the materials behave in your fingertips. Muscle memory becomes a second nervous system. My preparation involved controls. I kept a packet of fibers, samples from thrift store purchases, textiles with odd weaves, a scrap of scarf bought in a winter sale and labeled with the date I purchased it. It was not sentimental. It was inventory. Inventory is the only honest archive for someone who prefers numbers to memory. I cataloged the fiber's composition, its likely lab reaction to staining agents, the typical confidence interval a technician would assign to its origin. I rehearsed the lift procedure in my head. Drumstick of adhesive gel, careful angle, transfer to card, label with a code no one would link back to me. The thought pleased me like the hum of a well-tuned machine. Then there was the rehearsal of failure. I ran scenarios where the trace caused a dead end. An officer noted it, raised it in a briefing, then found nothing. I modeled the disappointment like a scientist would model an experiment that fails to produce statistical significance. It is important, I decided, to be able to catalog disappointment without becoming its prey. The worst outcome would not be capture, but desiring capture, because it would mean my need for validation had outstripped my discipline. I argued with myself. That deserves emphasis, because it was not a conversation of morality so much as a calibration of appetites. One part of me saw the trace as an extension of craft, teaching the city to read. Another part warned that once you ask the city to look, you may find a gaze that does more than observe. I understood that recognition can be a tool or a guillotine. I weighed which tool I preferred. On the third night of planning, I sat in my car with the engine off and the city lights pooling in the windshield like static. I counted, 4 in, 4 out. The counting is not superstitious, it is measurement. It slows thought into segments the mind can evaluate without sentiment. My hands were steady, my breathing matched the rhythm. The structure of the world felt repairable in that moment, like a clock you can take apart and place back together without missing a tooth. Finally, I decided not to make the trace an argument, but an inquiry. It must be a sentence addressed to someone trained to read sentences. I considered writing an actual line of text, a sentence that would do the job of both bait and mirror, but language is theatrical. A literal inscription invites copycats and pundits alike. So I chose material grammar instead. A ridge, a fiber, a hair. Illocution without flourish. I chose the place with care. A showroom with glass that catches light in a way technicians esteem. A place where a curious hand might linger, where the surface is vertical and thus less likely to be wiped clean in routine sweeps. I went to the location in daylight twice to calibrate foot traffic and nighttime staff routines. I photographed the angles in my head. I felt the glass under my gloved palm in imagination. Design solves problem before execution. When I placed the trace, it was done with an economy that felt almost religious. The partial print rested like a comma, not claiming the sentence, only suggesting a pause. The fiber was folded against a lip so casually that it could pass as debris, unless someone decided it required a closer look. I did not write a confession, I wrote an invitation. So I left something, not evidence, an invitation.